In the early 2000s, a hunter who ventured into the wilderness in Michigan encountered something that frightened him so badly it changed the course of his life for the worse and ultimately led to something terrible. In fact, many hunters are experiencing things in the wilderness they simply can't explain. Strange sights, sounds, and other phenomena that isn't easily explained away. In today's episode, you're going to hear several strange and frightening stories from hunters that will make you rethink going into the woods. You won't want to miss this one. Years ago, Amelia grew up on a massive farm in northern Michigan between Harrison and Marion and Clare County. The farm, which was owned by her family, was a sprawling 5,000-acre property, mostly consisting of pastures and forests. It was a rather isolated area, with the nearest neighbors being far enough away that it felt like they were truly in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, Amelia's family were avid outdoorsmen, so the isolation didn't bother them. I mean, they loved hunting, hiking, fishing, and their farm provided ample opportunities for all of their favorite activities. Amelia, in particular, spent a lot of her time in the woods, and she was a tomboy, and since she had a lot of male family members, like her brother's father and uncles, she would often find herself roaming in the forest without them. And it was her two uncles, who she referred to as Theo and Harry, that started the family's fear of the forest. You see, Amelia really idolized Theo, who was her father's brother. He was a huge man, like standing like 6 feet 4 inches tall and just built like a pro wrestler. And he was easily the best hunter in the family, and he's a guy who just knew the forest like the back of his hand. One of those guys. And he would eventually join the military and actually become a senior naval non-commissioned officer in a prominent special forces division. This was a guy who was completely fearless, except for the one thing he would see in the forest. Now, Amelia vividly remembers the day that Theo came home from the forest completely shaken up. She was about 7 years old at the time, and this was right around deer season, and so Theo had been out all day, and he comes back much earlier than expected, and he's very, very visibly upset. And so he bursts through the door, tears are streaming down his face, and he's shaking and he's trembling. Now, this is very off-putting for Amelia because she had never seen him before like this. And this was the kind of guy who would rather die than let anyone see him cry or see his emotions be shown, but here he was in a clear state of distress. Now, Amelia's grandmother, Theo's mother, rushes to his side asking him what was wrong, but he just simply couldn't articulate it. It's like he was in this state of shock that whatever had happened. He just kept saying that he had seen something, that it was tall and it walked like a man, but its whole body was covered in fur. And he kept referring to it as a Bigfoot, but he said it wasn't Bigfoot, that it had the features of a wolf. Now, Amelia's grandmother, not knowing how to handle her son, just gathered all the men she could find in the house, which included Amelia's father, her grandfather, a few cousins, and Theo, and they would all go downstairs, arm themselves with shotguns, and at this time, Theo was still in a state of great distress, and he just kept saying that he didn't want the men to think he was a chicken, but he was very genuinely terrified. And so the men go outside towards the stables to saddle their horses, and Amelia starts to follow after them, being curious and 7 years old. But her father turns around and almost in a scolding tone tells her to stay inside and do not come out for any reason whatsoever. Now, this was the real first time that Amelia had ever heard her father speak in such a harsh and serious tone. She knew instinctively that something was very wrong. And of course, her grandfather would echo a very similar sentiment, and Amelia ended up staying up in her room for the rest of the day. And so hours go by and the sun would set and the men still had not returned. Now at this point, Amelia was very worried because they would never stay in the woods until after dark. And so finally she hears the sounds of the horses running to the barn and their voices, and she's so relieved. But there was something wrong. They all had this troubled expression on their face when they came to the house. I mean, if something was wrong, they wore it on their sleeve. Nobody said anything, probably not wanting to scare Amelia. And so they just tried their best to just keep everything quiet and to settle down. And so dinner came, and Amelia's father looked at her and laid down the law. And he basically told her that she was no longer allowed to play outside, no ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts, and she was no longer allowed to go anywhere near the barn alone. She was to be accompanied by either her father or her grandfather at all times. There was no debate about it. Now, Amelia was obviously shocked by this, as any 7-year-old would be. I mean, that's like your freedom being taken away. But there was just something... There's like something hidden between the lines that she couldn't quite make out. She knew even at 7 years old that something was wrong. But she had to do what she had to do, and she obeyed. So the next morning, her father and grandfather started teaching her how to shoot, which they had never done with her before. And so she knew that this meant that whatever this whole thing was about, it was very serious. Now, after her lesson, she went back inside and just tried to spend the day as any 7-year-old would be. But she couldn't help but eavesdrop on the adults later on that evening. And in a very serious, concerned tone, they were all standing around and trying to discuss what they had come across in the woods the day prior. Now, she could only really hear snippets, but it was enough to make her hair stand on end. They were talking about gouges, deep ones in tree trunks, and thick ones about roughly 8 or so feet off the ground, and she heard them talking about tracks in the snow that were like a dog, but bigger than a dog and larger than a wolf. Now, all the adults, despite being very familiar with the animals in the northern area of Michigan, were completely stumped. It didn't look like anything they had ever seen a bear leave behind. It could have been a wolf, but no wolves get this big. None of them. And Amelia said that winter was especially long, dark, and ominous. And so the family would continue to find claw marks on trees and oversized paw prints in the snow as fall quickly bled into winter, no pun intended. And then there were all the livestock deaths. Now, in the course of winter, between 30 and 40 of their cattle were brutally slaughtered with no explanation. I mean, this wasn't just a killing. They were ripped to pieces, torn apart. It was horrendous. However, the worst loss was Theo. He never recovered from what he experienced or saw that day in the forest, and Amelia had never seen him drink. But at this time, trying to reel from his experience, he was now rarely ever seen without a bottle of Jack Daniels. His eyes were always distant, as if he was constantly replaying that terrifying sight from that fall. And as years would go on, Theo just seemed to be trapped in this day, that same day in the woods, that completely changed him. Now, at first it was slow, but over time he just began to recede from his family and just kind of become a hermit and just drink heavily and heavily and heavily. And although he did continue to have a successful military career, serving in the US Navy all the way through Operation Iraqi Freedom, he was completely different at home. He stopped hunting, he would never go back into the woods, and just eventually stopped coming to the farm whenever he was stateside. In fact, something was wrong. He would even skip his own father's funeral only 2 years later. Unfortunately, Theo eventually died by his own hand, at least according to the coroner. There was an autopsy that was revealed that he had consumed 5 times the legal limit of alcohol and had signs of narcotic abuse, although that wasn't what actually killed him. The official cause of death was a faulty gas connection on his camper, which led to him asphyxiating due to carbon monoxide. And so to this day, Amelia can't reconcile the fact that he was using drugs or that he died by suicide. She knew that he had drank, but what happened just seems so out of character, and Yet he was a devout Catholic, so he would have had second thoughts about ending his own life. It just didn't make sense to her. Now, Theo wasn't the only family member to have a strange encounter in the woods of northern Michigan. She had another uncle, Henry, who had actually gone missing for days in the Manistee National Forest back in 2012. He was found 4 days later, but nobody, including him, seemed to have any idea what had happened to him. The strange animal that shook up the entire family, and what Theo saw that one day in the woods that would forever change him and lead to his demise, remains a mystery. In October of 2018, Chuck, a bow hunter in Pennsylvania, found himself in a strange and unsettling situation. He had been out hunting all day and his return trip was a little later than he would have liked. And so the sun was beginning to set and crest behind a mountain, and because of this, it started to get dark a lot sooner. And so trying to battle the fading light and dealing with the heavy tree coverage, it was becoming increasingly difficult to see where he was going. But fortunately, Chuck was able to make it to the bottom of the mountainside, and he noticed something odd. So he starts looking around and he notices that it's gone deathly silent, that you can hear a pin drop. Everything was just dead still. Now, he thought this was odd, but he had experienced this before while he was hunting. So he just took note of it and just kind of kept looking over his shoulder for deer and was like, you know what? I'm just going to keep pressing on, and it is what it is. Now, Chuck had hunted on this mountain many times in the past, but he had never been in this particular section of the woods. And so, he continues to creep through, and like I said, he's looking for deer. And he's walking very slowly because, he doesn't want to make any noise. And then he hears something that would shake him. He hears a voice call out to him from behind a thicket of small trees close by. And it's not what was said, it's who he thought said it. Now, the voice would say, "Help, Chuck, come over here, I'm in trouble, help." And so Chuck kind of had to snap to reality for a second as he hears this, because the sound, it is his brother's voice. But there's an issue here, is that his brother lives in Nevada, so it couldn't be his brother, but it was definitely in his voice. And so in that brief moment, his brain is kind of going in haywire mode, just trying to go through a series of realizations. And even though he recognized the voice, he did want to run in that direction to help the person because clearly somebody was in dire need. But he realized that no, that there's something very wrong about this situation with the woods going quiet and now this. And he just reacted. He ran out of the woods faster than he ever had before, and he left it at that. Now, over the course of the next 4 months, Chuck would actually tell his story and would explain that he had no idea what it was, and whatever it was gave him the creeps about ever going back to that section of woods again. He'd even contemplated about moving to the desert where his brother was, because at least out there, you can see everything around you. As far as the voice being his father pulling a prank on him, well, his father is way too old, so it wasn't really an option. Now, whether he was just hearing things, it was a skinwalker, a mimic, whatever you want to call it that was out there mimicking his brother's voice, it's a mystery. Nobody knows. In late 2023, Jeff, who was a hunter, had been invited by a close friend to go hunt at night on a large piece of private property. This piece of property was very large, open, and actually had several greenhouses scattered all throughout it. And so their plan was quite simple, and that was to arrive there shortly after dark and find their usual spot to go and prepare. And so this is exactly what they did when they had arrived. And they would do all the usual things, like check their firearms and their equipment and kind of, scour through their gear to make sure that they were fully prepared and ready. And at this point, they had the cover of complete and total darkness on their side, so they were actually able to scout around and move quietly very easily. In fact, the first area they wanted to scout by was a nearby greenhouse. However, there was something different that evening. Now, fortunately for them, it was a pretty well lit evening with a full moon casting its glow down so they could see, and because of this, they were able to see a figure that was in the distance. Now, I should say here that seeing a person at night isn't exactly rare, but it was definitely out of place considering where they were at and what they were seeing. I'll let that sink in. In fact, this would stand out to Jeff because whoever this person was seemed tall. In fact, abnormally, absurdly tall. Even more so when compared to the greenhouse that it stood beside. And yes, I said it. As he's looking at this figure in the distance, nothing is making sense because this thing would have had to have been at least 12 feet tall. So he's thinking to himself, there's no way that I'm seeing what this is. And so he's trying to just squint in the darkness and just trying to gather all the details he possibly can as they're kind of, slowly and slyly moving about to the greenhouse. Now he's doing his best to convince himself that he's maybe just seeing shadows because that does happen at night. But all he could see is not really a person. It was just this black outline. Now that kind of just further validated his opinion that this was just a shadow and nothing more. But keep in mind that the entire time Jeff is seeing this strange figure in the distance, he's not saying anything to his hunting buddy who's traveling right alongside with him. He's kind of just keeping it to himself because it's so strange and, well, he doesn't want to seem like a weirdo. Well, once these two men reach their first destination, which is a greenhouse they had scouted, everything around both of these men just goes completely silent. Now this just made the atmosphere all the more terrifying. And after about a minute or so, Jeff's friend would actually speak up and he begins asking him if he's seeing that. Now, the fact that Jeff's friend was also seeing this shadowy figure too was just this awful validation that he wasn't just having an hallucination, but that he was actually seeing something that was there. And in fact, it hadn't even moved at all because both men would look in the distance and they would still see this tall, just statuesque dark mass standing there. And within a moment or two, the figure just suddenly vanishes with no explanation whatsoever. However, the experience doesn't end there, and in fact, it gets far stranger. Within only moments after this happened, both of these men began hearing strange noises. At first, both men would describe what sounded like footsteps that were circling around their position. And then it got even more weird because the sounds they started hearing were what they would describe as clicking sounds or something similar to somebody snapping their fingers only inches away from their ears. And obviously at this point, both of them are very scared. They're confused. They have no idea what's going on, nor do they have any way to rationally try and explain what's happening. So they pull out their flashlight, which at this point, it's important by the way, is roughly about 80% or so battery life. And they're scanning the area around them frantically, but they can't see a thing. There is nothing that makes any sort of rational sense as to why they're hearing the noises they are. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, as things continue on, they're continuously getting more and more freaked out. And so at one point, they just decide that, you know what, we should just leave and just abandon the mission altogether. Now, it's interesting is that it had only been a very short time between the time that they started hearing these weird noises that they couldn't explain and the time that they decided to leave the property, and somehow their battery on their flashlight had drained down to 40%. And in fact, only a few minutes go by and their flashlight would go from 40% down to 1%. 30 seconds later, boom, dead. And instantly, well, not instantly, but instantly, they were completely plunged into darkness before they were able to fully escape the property. Now, as both men are exiting as close as they can, Jeff begins to notice this weird sensation on his hands. I mean, he's cold and his hands are cold, but there's something else wrong. And so what do you do when your hands are cold, right? You kind of rub them together. But as he's doing this, he feels this strange sensation on his left hand, specifically on his knuckles, and so he looks down and he sees that there are 3 distinctive burn marks on his knuckles. Now, he has no way to explain what happened. He hadn't been around fire or any intense heat that would cause this. But what's even far stranger is Jeff's experience the following day. So the next day comes and he calls his buddy, the same guy who had gone out hunting with him just last night, and his friend actually talks about that he had been seeing that strange shadowy figure outside his own house, which was very, very odd at this point, right? And so Jeff is telling his friend, about the weird burn marks on his hand, and they have no idea what to make of it. Obviously, they're weirded out. They think it's creepy, but it is what it is at that point. And so about a week or so goes by, and, life is fairly normal. And Jeff actually comes across a handprint that's on the outside of his bedroom window. But there's a problem with that. The window is on the second story of the house. So explain that one to me. Now, a few more weeks goes by, and he too, Jeff, starts seeing a shorter version of the same shadow figure that he saw that night on the property in his house and around it all the time. As you can imagine, this has completely terrified Jeff, but unfortunately, we have no idea what became of him or of his experiences, because that's where he left things off. The strange, shadowy entity that him and his friends saw on that private property that night remains inconclusive. In September of 2021, Pietro, who was a hunter, was extremely excited to start deer season. Unfortunately, feral hogs had moved into the area and quickly descended upon his favorite hunting spot. And now, if anyone watching this is at all educated on how devastating feral hogs can be and are, eating all the vegetation, driving out the deer, and of course, the vegetation they eat on is what the deer eat, so it just drives away game, and also they're kind of just a big nuisance. But during his time to try and put an end to this inconvenience, he would spend more time in his deer stand at night waiting for the perfect ambush opportunity. He would soon learn that things were not as they seemed. So Pietro and his partner both lived on the same piece of property that also doubled as their hunting grounds in Texas. Pietro himself is not really an inexperienced woodsman. This is a guy who has grown up camping and hiking during most times of the year, like I'm sure a lot of you watching this are, and this is a guy who's very accustomed to hearing all the various noises of nature moving around at night, and so he's not easily spooked by things. This is a guy who has also spent 6 years in active duty military, but described that their gut instinct would tell them that there was something more to what they were seeing and experiencing to each of the following situations. And so the first incident in question would occur sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning, and it just started with him noticing an odd kind of whirring or flapping noise, as he described. He couldn't really explain what they were hearing because it was so out of place, and he wasn't crazy because his hunting partner who was with him had also heard it. And now they're not really able to discern what it is or where it's coming from, but they could both agree that whatever this noise was actually coming from their left-hand side and then quickly passing overhead. What's really strange is that they both agreed it was not a bird. It sounded far too mechanical, nor did it sound like any drone or anything that they could properly make out. The unfortunate thing is that they couldn't make out what it was because they never actually saw it. It's as if whatever the noise was just kind of flew overhead and just vanished into the night. And then about a week later, and the two of them were actually at Pietro's home, and it's, roughly about 9 or 9:30 at night, and both the men hear this strange, loud, distant boom that shakes the entire house. It was so startling that both men were convinced it was some sort of artillery that had been detonated. And of course, they're freaking out. They're looking on the news to see if there's any report of some sort of sonic boom that had taken place, but there was nothing. In fact, after scouring online and on the news on TV, they were only able to find a single story dating back to 2016 where a very similar noise had been heard, but its origin had never been discovered. And so both these men realized that there was just some strange stuff going on this piece of property during this time, during deer season, and they just couldn't quite put their finger on it. So the evening of November 4th, 2021 rolls around, and both men again are standing out near the tree stand. And, because it's November, at this point it's gotten cold, it's wet, it's rainy, and, on this particular day they've had a lot of rain, so just everything is damp and dripping and soaking wet. And on this evening, they've gone out to the tree stand. It's roughly about 10 or 10:30 at night. And if any of you have been out at all in the soaking cold rain, you know how hard it is to try and keep warm. It's just like the humidity is just this cold, wet blanket that just sucks the warmth right out of you. Well, that's what they were experiencing. And so Pietro's doing his best to just focus and trying to keep his toes and fingers warm, and the guy's freezing, and something happens. Basically, he becomes aware of this strange murmuring noise. And so he's looking around thinking like, what? Like, what am I hearing? And he looks and sees that his partner's hearing it too, which, by the way, is a feat because his partner has hearing damage. So he's like, all right, I'm not crazy. And the best way he could describe it was it kind of sounded like muffled voices that were off in the distance, but it was almost like several people having a conversation, just that was too far away to make out the individual words. But it was still close enough where you could hear voices. But with this, the direction they were hearing these voices was in a direction that was deeper into the woods. And there's no buildings or any sort of construction or structures anywhere around that direction. And so the voices they were hearing were of different tones. Now, despite the fact that both men had heard cows vocalizing all the time and around this area, and that it did sound similar to a cow moaning, it was very different. Not to mention that there actually isn't any grazing land in the vicinity of where the sound was coming from. And so these strange murmuring noises actually would crescendo over 30 seconds and then just die out completely, leaving both Pietro and his partner in complete and utter silence. They're baffled, they're confused, they don't know what to make of it. And so it was then afterwards that the woods around them had fell quiet, even more so than what it was already. Now, Pietro wasn't exactly scared in any of these situations, but he did describe how he felt that he was watched and noticed, and that he wasn't alone during these incidents, which makes you wonder what else was out there with him. We will never know. In 2015, Noah and his family would go on to purchase 11 acres of thickly wooded property in the northeastern portion of Minnesota. This was a piece of property that was definitely a fixer-upper. Folks, we've all seen those pieces of property. It had actually been a foreclosure and was in a complete state of disrepair. And so for the following few weeks, Noah and his family would try and spend as much time as possible just trying to, update things and fix things as quickly as they could. But the entire time that this house had been foreclosed, the animals in and around the area kind of got the memo, and they kind of just made it their routine to just waltz around this abandoned property like it had become, a part of their daily hunting routine. So they weren't scared of people. And so it was very often that Noah and his family would see a lot of wildlife, like coyotes and bears, without the slightest hint of fear of humans. And so one evening during a torrential rainstorm, Noah became very concerned that a broken downspout might cause his basement to flood. And it's about 10 or so at night, and so he's like, you know what? I just need to go check it out. It is what it is. And so he goes out there, he has a look, he's got his little headlamp on, and he's making sure that there's no possible cause for a flood. And so as he's doing this, he notices something. And by the way, he has his back facing a swampy area while he's trying to mess and fiddle with the downspout. And out of nowhere, he would have this overwhelming sensation that comes over him. It was like this intense feeling of fear and dread. And the dread was so overpowering that he had never felt this type of fear before. Now, we need to understand something about Noah. This is a man who does not believe in anything supernatural, and to him, any of that stuff could easily be explained away by high levels of belief, anxiety, and fear, right? Like the paranormal, supernatural, that's just nonsense. But the events that would follow in this story would soon change his beliefs. What he was feeling in this very moment was very unusual based on his circumstances. And so doing what any experienced woodsman would do, he just stays calm, he stays alert, and very slowly kind of just stands up, and he turns around to face the area where the swamp is, where his headlamp would actually shine and illuminate something that he would not be able to explain. What he saw was the reflection of eye shine staring back at him, and you need to know that this wasn't just typical eye shine like that of a deer or any normal animal. He was seeing different sets of eye shine that were at different heights, and so as soon as he sees them, he quickly turns off his headlamp and he realizes something is very wrong. The eyes are still glowing, as if a light was being shined into them, but the eyes themselves are illuminating this weird light. These eyes did not move, they just stood there completely stationary, and in that moment, he felt like he was in complete and total danger because he had no idea what sort of animal could be beyond this tall grass and weeds watching him. And realizing he had no choice, he quickly bolts back in the house as fast as he could, and he did his best to just try and process and rationalize that, you know what, it was just a deer and a raccoon, it was wet outside, it was raining, I couldn't see well, it is what it is. Now, despite his strange experience that evening, it wouldn't be too much longer before he would just outright completely forget about it for the time being. And, you know, some months would go by, and the summer's now kind of reaching its end point. And at this point, Noah had already put in a ton of work around the property, in the house, outside the house, and his porch was now almost fully screened in, which completely faces where the swamp is. And so one evening, he's just sitting out there on his front porch, just enjoying the calmness of the woods and nature, and it's roughly about 11 p.m. And so he's considering going inside and just hitting the hay when a strange noise abruptly comes out of the woods. And the only way Noah could accurately describe it was like, it sounded kind of like a cow fighting for its life against some sort of large predator of some kind. And Noah made these assumptions because just southwest of his property was actually a small farm, and so he's listening intently to what's going on, and he hears all these frantic calls coming from what he believes is a cow, combined with this larger, far more intimidating roar that he would describe as one of the most horrendous sounds he's ever heard. And basically, he wrote it off as a bear trying to eat a cow, and that's how he explained it away, even with how unusual it sounded. And this didn't really spook Noah because it's possible that there were noises that would happen in the woods that were beyond his recognition at the time, but he still just wrote it off as being something normal. And you know, years would go by and Noah and his family would continue to purchase more land. And in fact, they would purchase an additional 70 acres that went into the direction of where the small farm was located. And it was while he was surveying the property that he would realize the area where the cattle were kept was actually too far from his back porch to ever hear an animal held in that area. Now, this meant that the cows were nowhere near the tree line, and their enclosure was very well built and electrified, which ultimately meant that the odds of really anything getting out or coming in, like a cow, were very unlikely. Now, part of the reason why Noah and his family were very interested in purchasing this section of land was so that they could use it for hunting. And as a matter of fact, the very first deer season that they were there on this property, Noah had begun setting up tree stands and trail cameras all throughout this area of woods in preparation of this. Despite being extra cautious and, making his way through sections of woods that he would use, he noticed that there were things that stood out to him as being odd. He would notice spatters of dried blood on a tree trunk and circled by an old game snare, a tree at least a century old with barbed wire embedded in its trunk, or the remains of animals with bits of fur and even a leg cleaned down to the bone. In fact, he would actually take this picture because it showed strange markings on the trunks of trees that he couldn't identify. Again, Noah is a very experienced outdoorsman and hunter, but even he could not discern what those marks were from. They looked more like claw marks, but what would make those claw marks? And so soon, he would start to kind of put the pieces together that a lot of these strange things he's seen would all seem to circulate around a very specific section of forest. For whatever reason, the strange activity was really drawn to this section, which was a small rise in the landscape, kind of like a tiny hill. In fact, there would be several instances where Noah's son, who was also an experienced hunter, or I guess experienced for his age, would be out in the woods looking around or setting up trail cameras or just hiking around, and he would notice that the woods would fall completely quiet for extended periods of time without any reason. And he would also hear the sound of someone walking around that hill or that rise in the landscape, almost as if circling closer to him to get a better look. Noah would even go on to experience something strange of his own when hunting season began. Now, as he was in the strange section of forest where all this stuff is going on, he was currently en route to another tree stand when a violent thrashing in the foliage had actually got his attention. And so out of reaction, he looks over in that direction and notices something moving very fast, crossing from right to left, but moving away from his position. Immediately, the movement of whatever animal this came from was distinctly different than deer and bear, because Noah encountered them all the time and was very familiar with how their movements were, but this was entirely different. What's stranger is that whatever animal this was had made a high-pitched trumpeting sound combined with this bellowing noise, kind of like an elk, but it was still like nothing Noah had ever heard. And you have to remember where they are. There's no elk anywhere in that area. So Noah is looking, but there isn't any bounding or any raised white tail or large dark shape that would normally indicate a deer or bear. And so there really wasn't a physical form at all that he saw, just falling leaves and branches along with these strange noises. And so a year or so goes by, and while Noah was out in the woods doing some much needed forest management, his son is actually out looking for him, and his son's freaked out. And his son finds him and he's out of breath, he's stressed out, and he can't quite figure out what's going on. And so Noah's son tells his father that he had spotted somebody else on their property. Now, upon first glance, Noah's son suspected that it was his own father, but he tried to get closer, and this man was not only wearing a completely different set of clothing, but was also much taller than his father, paid no attention to Noah's son, and just kept going in the woods like he was on a mission. So really weird, right? And so he really had no way to describe or to explain away this large man. In fact, the other experience his son had is even stranger. There was a time where Noah's son and friend of his had gone into the woods one afternoon later in the day for just a quick walk around, and the sun was beginning to set in the evening time. And so before long, the pair of boys would adjust their course so that way that they would be walking right along the border between the forest and the field. And, so they would continue in this manner for actually quite a while, and they noticed that there was movement among the trees. And they're like, what is that? Is that an animal? And so they get closer and they could actually make out what this movement is. And then it seemed to be a figure that was making hand gestures or something. And of course, by this point, both boys are very curious because they have no idea who this person is or what it is. And Noah's son and friend saw what appeared to be a person or something like that waving their arms around. Now, as soon as this figure noticed these boys, it actually turns in their direction, faces them, and begins to approach them. And so Noah's son and friend would actually shout out a greeting, and this figure just suddenly stops. And it just sits there and completely stares at them. And at some point during this, Noah's son and friend kind of just snapped out of it like they were in some sort of trance, and they realized that what was going on was horrifically wrong. They immediately became overwhelmed by intense fear, and they fled back to the house. Now, once they got back to the house, Noah's son goes to his dad and he's explaining to him as fast as he can, he's terrified, what they had just experienced. But of course, Noah's like, boys, calm down. He just kind of wrote it off as them just being boys, and, something was just playing tricks on their mind. But Noah's son and his friend were adamant about what they had seen and experienced, and they even went into vivid detail of their description on what it was. And so after Noah gave them the time of day and had listened and heard them out for a little while, he began to realize that their description was simply too detailed to be a figment of their imagination. The figure they described seeing was around 10 to 15 feet tall, very skinny arms, and a body that was dark. I'm not talking hairy, just dark skin, and it was gaunt and emaciated and ugly and just bah, you know? And so as he's hearing all of this, Noah, he begins to worry that there might be addicts or trespassers or something on my property, so I need to go out there and check. And so he grabs his gun, the boys go with him, and they're going to go out there and they're going to show him the exact spot that they saw this thing. And so they get to the area, the boys point out the spot they saw it, and there's something wrong. Now you have to understand this is winter, so there's snow, and Noah can clearly see the tracks in the snow that were from his son and his son's friend. But when he looks at the spot where this supposed figure was seen, there's nothing there. There's no tracks, there's nothing. And so he's like, okay, something's going on here. Either you guys are completely full of it, but just something doesn't seem right. I don't got a good feeling about this at all. Obviously, there's no way that an animal or a person could have been out there without leaving any tracks. And Noah wasn't really sure what to make of it. It obviously spooked him, but what are you gonna do in that situation? He couldn't really explain it away, so he kind of just left it as is. So here's a potential twist on things. Now, remember that strange rise in the landscape I was telling you about where all this activity was and is centered around? Well, that rise is actually theorized to be a burial mound. Now, if you don't know anything about burial mounds, they are said to possess strange paranormal energy and actually be a host to strange entities that are guarding them. Actually, there are a plethora of eyewitness stories and accounts of people who have experienced paranormal phenomena, strange humanoids, and other supernatural entities in and around areas with burial mounds. Now, while this is just a theory and they don't really know, what's really weird is that in all 7 years of Noah and his family owning and living on this piece of property, not once did he ever capture anything on any of his game cameras. Never once, not anything, not deer, not possum, not raccoon, nothing. It was also very often that he would find animal carcasses in the forest that were eaten on, torn apart, you name it. And so even his wife would describe getting these sensations of being watched while in the woods, or she would hear these strange thrashing sounds going on in the underbrush that she couldn't discern. And so all of this activity all took place again in that general vicinity of that small hill. Now, the real question is, was this truly a burial mound and there really was some unforeseen predator lurking about this property? Or it was all in their head and it could all be explained away? Unfortunately, the truth is going to remain a mystery. And since you guys have made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment down below, become the hunted, so I know who made it to the end of the video and who did not. And if you guys enjoy videos like this one, be sure to slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this one. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you all in the very next episode.